A racist cop stops young black twins, convinced they're up to no good. But just 10 minutes after pulling them over, something shocking happens which leads him to beg the black twins for mercy. What did the twins do to make the cop beg? Who's really in control, and what will they do with his desperation? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the school parking lot as Officer Rick Stanton's patrol car pulled up to Westbrook Academy. His son, Tommy, bounced excitedly in the back seat, clutching his superhero lunchbox. "Have a great day, buddy," Rick said, watching Tommy through the rearview mirror. "Remember what we talked about. Be nice to everyone, okay?" "Yes, Dad." Tommy grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. He scrambled out of the car and joined the stream of uniformed students heading into the prestigious private school. Rick waited until Tommy disappeared through the heavy oak doors before pulling out his phone. He dialed home, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as it rang. "Hey, honey," he said when Sarah answered. "Just dropped Tommy off. Listen, I might be late tonight. We've got that neighborhood watch meeting I need to attend." "Okay, be safe out there," Sarah replied. "I'll keep dinner warm." "Love you," Rick said, smiling. "See you tonight." 20 minutes later, Rick was patrolling the quiet streets near Westbrook Academy when he spotted two teenage girls walking along the sidewalk in the school's distinctive navy blazers. His eyes narrowed as he slowed the patrol car. Something didn't look right to him. He knew most of the kids at Westbrook, and he'd never seen these two before. Rick flipped on his lights and pulled up beside them. The girls stopped walking, their expressions carefully neutral as they turned to face him. They were identical twins, both wearing the proper uniform, but their skin was dark. Too dark, Rick thought, for Westbrook students. "ID cards, please," he barked, stepping out of his car. The twins exchanged a quick glance before reaching into their backpacks. Their movements were deliberate and calm. "Sir, we're students here," one of them said quietly. "I'm Kylie Thompson, and this is my sister Shane. We forgot our ID cards." Rick studying them with obvious skepticism. "You forgot, or you are lying," he declared, though they appeared completely legitimate. "You two need to come with me to the station so we can sort this out." "Officer, we're just trying to get to class," Shane said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Our father can verify." "Listen here," Rick cut her off, stepping closer. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "I know your type. Think you can just waltz into any place you want? Westbrook's a prestigious school. You really expect me to believe you belong here? How could a black person like you even have the money to be here?" The twins remained silent, their faces masks of careful composure, even as Rick continued his verbal assault. Their dignified silence seemed to anger him further. "Get in the car," he ordered, gesturing to his patrol vehicle. "Both of you. We're going to have a nice long chat down at the station about identity theft and trespassing." Kylie and Shane complied without argument, though their shoulders were rigid with tension as they slid into the back seat. Rick slammed the door behind them, muttering under his breath about troublemakers and teaching them a lesson. As he started the car, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The twins sat perfectly still, their hands folded in their laps, faces forward. Their composure unnerved him. Most kids would be crying or protesting by now, but these two just sat there, dignified and silent, as if they knew something he didn't. "You're awful quiet back there," Rick sneered, pulling away from the curb. "Nothing to say for yourselves?" Neither girl responded. They simply exchanged another of those meaningful glances that made Rick's skin prickle with irritation. He turned up the radio to drown out the uncomfortable silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he drove toward the station. The morning traffic parted around them, other drivers pulling aside for the police car, unaware of the injustice taking place inside. The twins' school bags sat between them on the seat, their homework and textbooks evidence of their legitimate status as students, evidence Rick had chosen to ignore in favor of his own racial bias. Rick's eyes darted to his rearview mirror, noticing a black van that had been following his patrol car for the past few minutes. The vehicle kept a steady distance, not too close, but definitely trailing them. His police instincts kicked in and he straightened in his seat, preparing for potential trouble. The sudden ring of his phone cut through the tense silence. Rick fumbled with the device, nearly dropping it when he saw the caller ID. "Captain Matthews." "Officer Stanton speaking," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Stanton." The captain's voice was sharp enough to make him flinch. "Where are you right now?" "I'm bringing in 2 suspicious individuals from Westbrook Academy, sir." "2 teenage girls in Westbrook uniforms?" The captain's tone grew even harder. Rick's stomach dropped. "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea who those girls are, Stanton?" The captain paused, and Rick could hear him taking a deep breath. "Those are District Attorney Samuel Thompson's daughters, his twins." The blood drained from Rick's face. His hands began to shake on the steering wheel as the full implications hit him. D.A. Thompson, one of the most powerful and respected figures in the justice system. The man who could end his career with a single phone call. "Pull over immediately," the captain ordered. "Release those girls and report directly to D.A. Thompson's office. He's waiting for you." Rick's throat went dry. "Yes, sir, I'm really sorry," he managed to croak out before the line went dead. Rick's hands trembled as he pulled the patrol car to the curb. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before stepping out of the vehicle. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a physical force as he approached the rear door. The twins sat quietly in the back seat, their posture perfect despite the uncomfortable situation. Their matching Westbrook Academy uniforms were pristine, making Rick's hasty assumptions about them seem even more ridiculous now. He fumbled with his keys, the metal clinking together betraying his nervous state. I made a mistake," Rick said, his voice cracking slightly as he opened the door. "You're free to go." The girls exchanged a brief glance before carefully stepping out of the patrol car. Their faces remained neutral, but their eyes held a wisdom beyond their years. Rick shifted his weight from foot to foot, acutely aware of the black van that had pulled up behind his patrol car, its tinted windows concealing its occupants. "Look, I'm really sorry about this whole thing," Rick added, the words coming out rushed and mechanical. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd never quite broken. "It was just a misunderstanding, you know? These things happen sometimes." His voice trailed off as the twins continued to regard him silently. Their lack of response made him increasingly uncomfortable, and he found himself rambling to fill the void. "I mean, if I'd known who you were, who your father was?" The words died in his throat as he realized how that sounded. The twins' expressions didn't change, but something in their eyes made Rick want to shrink into himself. They didn't need to speak. Their dignity in the face of his prejudice spoke volumes. The sound of a car door opening behind them made Rick jump. Heavy footsteps approached, and he turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp black suit walking toward them. The man's presence commanded attention, his movements precise and purposeful. "Ladies," the man nodded to the twins, his voice deep and professional. "Your father is expecting you." The twins moved toward the black van without a word, their movements synchronized and graceful. Rick watched them go, feeling increasingly small under the security officer's stern gaze. "Officer Stanton," the man said, turning his full attention to Rick. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "I'm Marcus Williams, head of security for D.A. Thompson." He paused, letting the weight of his position sink in. "I want you to know that the DA will be fully briefed about today's events. Every detail." Rick swallowed hard, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. Marcus's words weren't a threat. They didn't need to be. The simple statement of fact carried enough weight to make Rick's knees feel weak. He watched helplessly as Marcus turned and walked back to the van, his perfectly polished shoes clicking against the pavement. The black van pulled away smoothly, leaving Rick standing alone on the sidewalk. The morning sun felt too bright, too exposing, as if spotlighting his shame for the whole world to see. His radio crackled with routine police chatter, but he barely heard it over the sound of his racing heart. The next day, Rick showed up at the DA's office. He sat in the hard plastic chair outside D.A. Thompson's office, his leg bouncing nervously. The precinct's usual buzz of activity felt distant, muffled by the weight of what awaited him behind those wooden doors. Captain Harris had already gone inside 10 minutes ago, leaving Rick alone with his thoughts. "Officer Stanton," the secretary called. "They're ready for you." Rick's legs felt like lead as he stood and walked into the office. D.A. Thompson sat behind his desk, his presence filling the room despite his calm demeanor. Captain Harris stood to the side, arms crossed, his expression grim. "Take a seat, Officer Stanton," D.A. Thompson said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. Rick lowered himself into the chair, his throat dry. "Sir, about yesterday?" D.A. Thompson held up a hand, silencing him. "Let me be clear, Officer Stanton. What happened yesterday wasn't just a misunderstanding. You detained 2 young women without cause, based solely on their appearance. That they happened to be my daughters only brought this incident to immediate attention." Rick stared at his hands, shame burning his cheeks. The DA's measured tone somehow made it worse than if he'd been yelling. "However," D.A. Thompson continued, "I believe in second chances and transformative justice. Captain Harris and I have discussed your situation at length." Rick glanced at his captain, who nodded slightly. "Instead of termination, we're transferring you to the 15th Precinct in Riverside," D.A. Thompson said. "It's a predominantly black community. You'll spend 6 months there, working directly with the community you've shown bias against." Rick's head snapped up. "Riverside? But that's 3 hours away." "This isn't a negotiation, Officer Stanton," Captain Harris spoke up. "It's this or your badge." Rick slumped in his chair, thinking of Sarah and little Emma. "My family." "Sometimes," D.A. Thompson said, his voice softening slightly. "We need distance from those we love to become better for them." Later that evening, Rick stood in his son, Tommy's bedroom doorway, watching as Sarah tucked him into bed. His packed bags waited by the front door. After Tommy's bedtime story, he kissed her forehead, trying to memorize her sweet, innocent face. In the living room, Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "You don't have to do this alone, Rick. We could come with you." Rick shook his head, pulling her close. "Tommy settled in his school here. You have your job, your friends. I won't uproot our whole family because of my mistake." He kissed her softly. "It's just 6 months. I'll be back before you know it." "Promise you'll call every day?" "Twice a day," he said, managing a small smile. "I love you both so much. That's why I have to do this right." Sarah helped him carry his bags to the car. As he pulled out of the driveway, he watched his family grow smaller in the rearview mirror, hoping these 6 months would help him become the man they deserved. Rick pulled into the parking lot of the 15th Precinct, his stomach in knots. The building was older than his previous station, with worn brick walls and faded signage. As he walked through the front doors, the usual morning bustle of a police station greeted him, but something felt different. Eyes turned toward him, lingering longer than usual. At the front desk, a sergeant glanced up from his paperwork. "Officer Stanton, they're expecting you in the captain's office." Walking through the bullpen, Rick felt the weight of stares from his new colleagues. Whispers followed him. "That's the one from the Thompson case," someone muttered. Rick kept his eyes forward, his shoulders tense. The captain's office door was open. Inside, Captain Martinez sat behind her desk, and beside her stood a tall black officer with graying temples and a commanding presence. "Officer Stanton," Captain Martinez said, her tone professional but cool. "Welcome to the 15th. This is Officer Thomas King. He'll be your partner and mentor during your time here." Officer King didn't offer his hand. Instead, he studied Rick with penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through him. "We'll be working community patrol together," King said, his deep voice carrying authority earned through years of service. As they walked through the neighborhood later that morning, Rick noticed how people greeted Officer King warmly. Shop owners waved, kids called out his name, and elderly residents stopped to chat. The same people regarded Rick with suspicious glances or turned away entirely. At a local coffee shop, the owner handed Officer King his usual order, but barely acknowledged Rick's presence. Outside, a group of teenagers crossed the street rather than pass them on the sidewalk. "They know who you are," Officer King said as they continued their patrol. Word travels fast in this community. Every move you make, every interaction you have, will be watched and remembered. They stopped at a corner and Officer King turned to face Rick directly. Let me be clear, Stanton. I've spent 20 years building trust in this neighborhood. I'm not going to let 6 months of poor judgment on your part undo that work. King's eyes hardened. The captain may have assigned me to mentor you, but make no mistake. I'll be watching you just as closely as everyone else. One wrong move, one hint of the behavior that brought you here, and I'll personally make sure you never wear a badge again. Are we clear? Rick swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, sir, crystal clear. Good, King replied. Let's continue our patrol. The morning sun beat down on Rick as he walked his assigned beat, the weight of his badge feeling heavier than usual. Every storefront window seemed to hold watching eyes, and every street corner emptied as he approached. The neighborhood, with its mix of small businesses and residential buildings, might have felt welcoming under different circumstances. Mrs. Johnson's bakery, usually filled with the warm scent of fresh bread and friendly chatter, went quiet when Rick passed by. Through the glass, he saw the elderly owner quickly turn away, ushering her customers toward the back of the shop. The open sign flickered in the window, but the message was clear. He wasn't welcome. At the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard, 2 fellow officers from the precinct crossed the street rather than share the sidewalk with him. One of them, a black cop named Officer Williams, had smiled at him during morning briefing, but now acted as if Rick was invisible. Their patrol car pulled away with a slight screech of tires, leaving Rick alone with the whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere. Rick felt their eyes on him, judging, remembering, knowing. The local diner where officers usually grabbed lunch was his next stop. As he pushed open the door, the usual buzz of conversation died. Several patrons, including 2 officers from his precinct, gathered their things and left, leaving half-eaten meals behind. The waitress took one look at him and disappeared into the kitchen. Rick stood there alone in the doorway, the bell above still tinkling. After a moment, he backed out, letting the door close softly behind him. His stomach growled, but he kept walking. Walking back toward his patrol car, Rick noticed how his fellow officers moved away from him like water parting around a stone. Store owners suddenly found reasons to adjust their window displays or step inside. Parents called their children closer. Even the street vendors selling newspapers and fresh fruit turned their backs when he passed. The message couldn't have been clearer if it had been painted on every wall in the neighborhood. Rick Stanton was an outsider, unwanted and unwelcome in this black neighborhood. His uniform, meant to represent protection and service, seemed to act as a barrier between him and everyone else. Each step of his patrol reminded him that he wasn't just new to the beat. He was the officer who had profiled and wrongly detained the DA's children, and no one was going to let him forget it. Rick found Officer King in the break room after his patrol, slumped in a metal chair with his shoulders heavy. The older officer was reading through some paperwork, but looked up when Rick entered. "They all hate me," Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every single person out there." King set down his papers and studied Rick's face. "Hate's a strong word. They don't trust you. There's a difference." "What's the point?" Rick dropped into a chair across from King. "No matter what I do, they're going to remember what happened with the DA's kids." "You're right about one thing," King said, leaning forward. "They will remember, but they'll also remember what you do next. Trust isn't something you can demand or force. It's something you earn day by day, action by action." Rick ran a hand through his hair. "How? They won't even look at me." "Start small," King suggested. "Learn people's names. Say good morning, even if they don't say it back. Show up at community events, not as a cop, but as a person who cares. Visit the senior center on 4th Street. Those folks have seen everything in this neighborhood, good and bad. They're usually willing to give second chances." "The senior center?" Rick asked, skeptical. King nodded. "They have a weekly bingo night. They're always short on volunteers, and Mrs. Washington, who runs it, makes the best sweet potato pie you'll ever taste." He paused. "You could also help out at the youth center. Coach Martinez runs basketball programs for kids after school. Having an officer there, teaching kids to shoot hoops instead of just patrolling outside, that makes a difference. What if they don't want me there? Then you keep showing up anyway. You prove you're not there to police them, but to support them. Visit local businesses, not to check for violations, but to actually talk to the owners. Learn their stories. Let them learn yours. Rick absorbed this, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. There's also the neighborhood cleanup committee, King continued. They meet every Saturday morning. Pick up trash, plant flowers, fix up old buildings. Nothing builds trust like working side by side with people, getting your hands dirty for the good of the community. These people crossed the street to avoid me today, Rick said quietly.
Sit down.
Then tomorrow you give them a reason to stay on the same side, King replied firmly. Look, Stanton, nobody's expecting you to transform overnight, but they are watching to see if you're willing to try, to learn, to change. The question is, are you? The break room fell silent as Rick considered King's words. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow louder in the quiet. I don't know if I can do all that, Rick admitted. Nobody's asking you to do it all at once, King said. Pick one thing. Start there. Maybe join the neighborhood watch meetings, not as a cop giving orders, but as someone who wants to hear the community's concerns. Or volunteer at the food bank on Wilson Street. Actions speak louder than words, and right now your actions need to tell a new story. The call came in just as Rick was finishing up his paperwork. A house fire on Maple Street, smoke visible from blocks away. As he sped toward the scene, his radio crackled with updates about fire trucks en route. When Rick arrived, thick black smoke was already billowing from the second-floor windows of an old Victorian house. But what struck him wasn't just the fire. It was the scene unfolding on the street below. At least 20 residents had formed a bucket brigade, passing containers of water from house to house. Others were using garden hoses, doing what they could to contain the flames. An elderly man directed people with the authority of a fire chief, pointing and calling out instructions. Someone's still inside. A woman's scream cut through the chaos. Mrs. Jenkins, she lives in the upstairs apartment. Without hesitation, 3 young men rushed toward the burning house. Rick watched in amazement as they coordinated their efforts, one breaking a lower window while another grabbed a ladder from a nearby garage. Here, Rick called out, running to help position the ladder. The men barely acknowledged him, focused entirely on their rescue mission. 2 climbed up while the third stayed below, ready to help if needed. Minutes that felt like hours passed. The smoke grew thicker, and Rick could hear the approaching sirens of fire trucks. Just then, the 2 men appeared at the window, supporting an elderly woman between them. The crowd below erupted in cheers as they carefully helped her down the ladder. Rick jumped in to assist, helping Mrs. Jenkins to steady ground. She was coughing but conscious, her nightgown covered in soot. Immediately, a neighbor wrapped her in a blanket, while another brought over a bottle of water. As fire trucks finally arrived, Rick stood back watching the community in action. People were consoling Mrs. Jenkins, offering her a place to stay. Others were already discussing fundraising efforts to help with repairs. Children ran between houses, bringing more water and blankets. "Thank you for your help, officer," one of the rescue volunteers said, nodding briefly at Rick before turning back to the group. It wasn't much, just a simple acknowledgement, but it felt like the first crack in the wall of distrust. Rick observed how seamlessly everyone worked together, young and old, coordinating efforts without need for official direction. There was no hesitation, no waiting for permission or authority. They simply saw a neighbor in need and acted. The fire department took over, their hoses making quick work of the remaining flames. But the community didn't disperse. Instead, they stayed, offering support, making plans, ensuring Mrs. Jenkins would be taken care of. Rick stood at the edge of the crowd, his perspective shifting. These weren't just residents in his patrol area. They were a family looking out for each other. The unity he witnessed challenged everything he'd assumed about this neighborhood. As he watched a young girl offer Mrs. Jenkins her favorite stuffed animal to help her feel better, Rick felt something inside him begin to change. This wasn't the neighborhood he'd expected to find when he'd first arrived. These people weren't statistics or stereotypes. They were heroes in their own right, showing more courage and compassion than he'd seen in years of police work. The day after the fire, Rick drove past Mrs. Jenkins's charred house during his morning patrol. He slowed his cruiser, noticing a crowd gathered on the sidewalk. His first instinct was to investigate what he assumed might be trouble, but as he pulled closer, he realized what was actually happening. Neighbors had set up folding tables along the street, piling them with clothes, blankets, and household items. A woman was organizing everything into neat sections, while others continued bringing more supplies. Children carried boxes of toys, carefully selecting which ones to donate. Rick parked his patrol car and stepped out, watching as people came and went. Some brought grocery bags full of canned goods, others carried furniture on pickup trucks. An elderly man wheeled over a nearly new microwave in a shopping cart. Everything they owned was destroyed, Rick overheard a woman saying as she sorted through a box of kitchen supplies. The insurance won't cover most of it. Their policy was basic, but we'll make sure they get back on their feet. A teenage boy struggled past with a heavy desk. Rick stepped forward automatically. Need help with that? The boy hesitated for a moment, studying Rick's face, then nodded. Together, they carried the desk to where other furniture was being collected. As they set it down, Rick noticed a sign taped to a nearby table. Jenkins Family Relief Fund. Every dollar helps. A glass jar sat on the table, already half full of bills and change. Next to it, a notebook listed offers of temporary housing, meals, and other assistance. The pages were filled with names, phone numbers, and detailed notes about what each person could provide. "Mrs. Jenkins is staying with my family," said an older woman who was adding another entry to the notebook. "My daughter moved out last year for college, so we have the extra room. She can stay as long as she needs." Rick stood there, taking it all in. He thought about his own neighborhood, wondering if people would come together like this if disaster struck. Would they open their homes to strangers? Share what little they had? A group of kids ran past, carrying bags of clothes and shouting excitedly about helping. Their parents followed behind with boxes of dishes and cookware, calling out thanks to those who were organizing the donations. "Officer Stanton?" a familiar voice called. He turned to see one of the men who had helped rescue Mrs. Jenkins. "If you're not too busy, we could use some help moving these heavier items." Rick nodded, removing his jacket. For the next hour, he worked alongside the community members, carrying furniture, organizing supplies, and listening to their stories about Mrs. Jenkins, how she always baked cookies for the neighborhood kids, how she taught piano lessons for free to families who couldn't afford them. As he helped sort through donations, Rick felt something shift inside him. These people, whom he'd viewed with suspicion just days ago, were showing him what community really meant. They weren't waiting for official help or government assistance. They were taking care of their own, pooling their resources, sharing what they had. He thought about the assumptions he'd carried with him when he first arrived. How wrong he'd been about this neighborhood, about these people. The strength he witnessed wasn't in their physical possessions or economic status. It was in their connections to each other, their willingness to help, their sense of shared responsibility. After his shift ended, Rick stopped at Martin's Grocery on Cedar Street to pick up some essentials. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he walked the aisles, basket in hand, the linoleum floors squeaking beneath his feet. His mind was still processing the events from earlier at the donation drive, replaying moments like a movie he couldn't pause. At the checkout line, he stood behind an elderly woman who was carefully counting out coins from her worn leather purse, her fingers moving with deliberate precision. The cashier, a young man with braces and kind eyes, patiently waited as she sorted through her change, offering an encouraging smile. "That comes to $43.27, Mrs. Wilson," the cashier said softly, his voice gentle and respectful. The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly as she counted her money again, her shoulders hunching with embarrassment. "Oh dear," she whispered, her voice quavering. "I'm afraid I'm a bit short. Could you remove the coffee and the fruit, please?" Her face flushed with shame. Before the cashier could respond, a tall man behind Rick stepped forward. He wore work clothes stained with paint and plaster, his boots dusty from what looked like construction work. His weathered face showed the kind of wisdom that comes from years of honest labor. "How much is she short?" the man asked, already pulling out his worn leather wallet. "About $12, the cashier replied, glancing between them. "I'll cover it," the man said, handing over a $20 bill without hesitation. "My mama taught me to always help when you can. She'd have my hide if I didn't." Mrs. Wilson's eyes welled up with tears, her lined face crumpling with emotion. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "Please," the man insisted gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It would make my mama proud to know I helped someone today. That's worth more than money." Rick watched as Mrs. Wilson's resistance melted into gratitude. She reached up and patted the man's cheek with a weathered hand, her touch maternal and gentle. "God bless you, young man. God bless you." Her voice trembled with genuine emotion. The man helped her bag her groceries, carefully arranging the items so nothing would get crushed, and another customer, a middle-aged woman in scrubs, offered to carry them to her car. Rick stood there, his own items forgotten on the conveyor belt, watching this simple act of kindness unfold like a flower in the sun. After paying for his groceries, Rick headed toward the parking lot. The evening air was cooling down, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and distant barbecues, and the sky had taken on the deep purple hue of approaching dusk. Streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the asphalt and creating pools of warm yellow light. He thought about how that man hadn't hesitated to help Mrs. Wilson, hadn't even paused to consider the cost or inconvenience. There had been no expectation of repayment, no desire for recognition, just a simple, immediate response to someone in need. It reminded him of the donation drive earlier, of neighbors helping neighbors without question or condition, their generosity flowing as naturally as breathing. As Rick walked to his car, the plastic bags rustling in his grip, he realized that the kindness he'd witnessed wasn't extraordinary to these people. It was just their way of life, as natural as the sunset painting the sky above him. They looked out for each other, supported one another, created a safety net woven from small acts of compassion and understanding. Each gesture, no matter how small, strengthened the invisible bonds that held their community together. Rick's steps faltered as he approached his car in the dimly lit parking lot. His heart sank at the sight before him. Large letters sprawled across his car's hood and doors in bright red spray paint. "Watch yourself, cop." The harsh words seemed to glow under the streetlights, impossible to ignore. He set his grocery bags down on the asphalt, his hands clenching into fists. The paint was still fresh, tiny droplets running down the sides of his car like tears. The acrid smell of spray paint filled his nostrils as he circled the vehicle, taking in the full extent of the damage. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Officer King. "Hey partner, you still at Martin's?" Her voice came through clear and steady. "Yeah," Rick replied, his voice tight with anger. "Someone vandalized my car. Must be those kids who were watching us earlier today. I'm going to—" "Hold up," Carla cut him off. "I'm 5 minutes away. Don't do anything until I get there." True to her word, Carla's patrol car pulled into the lot a few minutes later. She stepped out, her movements calm and measured as she assessed the situation. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store cast long shadows across her face as she examined the graffiti. "This isn't revenge, Rick," he said finally, turning to face him. "It's a warning." Rick scoffed, gesturing at his defaced car. "A warning? Look at this, Carla. This is straight-up vandalism. These people—" "These people," King interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind, "have seen officers like you come and go. Officers who didn't care to understand them, who saw them as problems instead of people." She stepped closer, her eyes meeting his. "This isn't about your car, Rick. It's about what you represent to them." Rick ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let this go?" "No," King replied. "You're supposed to think about it. Really think about why someone felt this was necessary. Remember how you treated those twin girls? That's still fresh in people's minds. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences come in the form of red spray paint." The truth in his words hit him harder than he expected. He looked at the graffiti again, seeing it differently now, not as an act of mindless vandalism, but as a message born from years of distrust and fear. "I'll help you file the report," King offered, already pulling out her notebook. "But Rick, take this as the wake-up call it's meant to be." After filing the report and covering the worst of the graffiti with some old newspapers from his trunk, Rick drove home to his temporary apartment. The small one-bedroom felt empty and cold, nothing like the warm home he'd left behind. He kicked off his shoes, barely bothering to change before collapsing onto the bed. As he lay there in the darkness, the day's events played through his mind. The house fire, the community's response, the grocery store kindness, and now this. The contrast was stark. The same community capable of such compassion was also capable of sending such a clear warning. He thought about what Officer King had said, about actions and consequences, about understanding rather than reacting. Rick sat on the edge of his bed, his phone pressed against his ear as he listened to the familiar ring. His heart lifted when Sarah's voice came through. "Hey, honey," she answered warmly. "I was just thinking about you." Rick's throat tightened. "I miss you both so much." He could hear Tommy playing in the background, the sound of his son's laughter making his chest ache. "Is that our little man I hear?" "He's playing with his new superhero toys," Sarah said. "Tommy, want to say hi to Daddy?" There was a shuffling sound, then Tommy's excited voice burst through. "Dad, I got an A on my science project." "That's amazing, buddy." Rick forced enthusiasm into his voice, though his eyes were burning. "I'm so proud of you." After a few more minutes of Tommy's chatter about school and friends, Sarah came back on the line. Rick heard her close a door, muffling the background noise. "How are you really doing?" she asked softly. Rick sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's different here. These people..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I hate being here, being away from you both. But I have to admit, they're not what I expected." "What do you mean?" "Today I saw this whole neighborhood come together for a family that lost everything in a fire. And at the store, this guy just paid for some old lady's groceries without thinking twice." Rick's voice grew quieter. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, Sarah." "That's good that you're seeing things differently," Sarah encouraged. "I know it's hard being away from us, but maybe this is exactly what you needed." "Maybe," Rick admitted, "but someone vandalized my car today. Spray painted it with warnings. Some people here still hate me." "Can you blame them? After what happened with the DA's daughters?" Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Give them time, Rick. Give yourself time." Rick lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. "I just want to come home." 6 months will go by faster than you think," Sarah assured him. "Tommy and I aren't going anywhere. We're right here, waiting for you to become the best version of yourself." Rick felt tears pricking at his eyes. "I love you both so much." "We love you too," Sarah replied softly. "Try to get some sleep, okay?" After they hung up, Rick remained on his bed, Sarah's words echoing in his mind. The loneliness of his empty apartment pressed in around him, but somehow, hearing their voices had made it a little more bearable. He closed his eyes, letting exhaustion pull him toward sleep, their conversation still playing in his thoughts. 6 months passed by very quickly, but Rick still harbored deep-seated prejudices beneath his polite exterior. While he had learned to work alongside his black colleagues and interact cordially with the community members, an underlying current of bias still poisoned his thoughts. During his time in the predominantly black precinct, Rick had mastered the art of playing nice. He'd learned to smile at the right moments, nod along during community meetings, and even participate in neighborhood events. But inside, his old attitudes festered like an untreated wound. On his last day, Officer King gave him a firm handshake. "I hope you learned something here, Rick," he said, her eyes searching his face. "Of course," Rick replied with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been educational." The drive back to his hometown felt like a release from prison. As the familiar streets came into view, Rick's shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. He pulled into his driveway, where Sarah and Tommy were waiting on the front porch. "Daddy!" Tommy sprinted down the steps, launching himself into Rick's arms. Rick hugged his son tight, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. Sarah approached more slowly, her eyes glistening with happy tears as she wrapped her arms around both of them. "Welcome home," she whispered. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Rick sat in his favorite armchair, nursing a beer. The comfort of being home only intensified his anger about the circumstances that had sent him away. His thoughts turned to the Thompson twins, their silent defiance during that traffic stop 6 months ago. Those girls, he muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the bottle. They think they're untouchable because of their daddy. Sarah looked up from her book on the couch. What was that? Nothing, Rick said quickly, but his mind was already churning with possibilities. He needed to show those girls that actions had consequences, that they couldn't just waltz around thinking they were better than everyone else. Maybe a little scare would teach them some respect. As he finished his beer, Rick began formulating a plan. He knew their routines from the initial incident report, which school they attended, their usual walking route home. It would be easy enough to arrange another chance encounter. I'm going to bed, he announced, kissing Sarah's forehead. But sleep was the last thing on his mind as he lay in bed, plotting his revenge against the Thompson twins who had inadvertently caused his 6-month exile. The evening shadows lengthened as Rick sat at his desktop computer, the blue light illuminating his determined face. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he accessed the school database through his police credentials. Within minutes, he had pulled up the files on Kylie and Shane Thompson. Same grade as Tommy, he muttered, scrolling through their information. His eyes narrowed as he read about their academic achievements and extracurricular activities. Honor roll students, student council members, community service awards. The list went on and on. Rick's jaw clenched. These girls had everything: privilege, status, and a powerful father to protect them. Yet they had caused him 6 months of separation from his family. The thought made his blood boil. He grabbed his car keys and headed to the nearby Walmart, his mind racing with ideas. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he pushed his cart through the aisles, filling it with an assortment of items: silly string, plastic wrap, super glue, stink bombs, and various other prank supplies. Just need to teach them a lesson, he whispered to himself, tossing a pack of permanent markers into the cart. Nothing too serious, just enough to shake them up a bit. At the checkout, the young cashier smiled pleasantly. Having a party? Rick forced a smile. Something like that. He paid in cash, not wanting any record of the purchase on his credit card. Back in his car, Rick sorted through his supplies, organizing them methodically. His police training kicked in as he planned each step carefully. He knew he had to be smart about this. No direct confrontation. Nothing that could be traced back to him. Just enough to make those girls understand that their actions had consequences. He pulled out his phone and opened the school's website, checking the upcoming events calendar. A slow smile spread across his face as he noticed the winter formal dance was approaching. Perfect timing. Those privileged Thompson girls wouldn't know what hit them. As Rick drove home with his trunk full of supplies, he felt a surge of satisfaction. 6 months of playing nice, of pretending to change. It was time to even the score. He parked in his garage and carefully hid the Walmart bags behind some old boxes, making sure Sarah wouldn't stumble upon them. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with a gentle autumn breeze rustling through the remaining leaves on the trees. Patches of golden sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dancing shadows on the ground below. Rick woke up earlier than usual, his mind already racing with anticipation, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and unease. After a rushed breakfast of cold toast and bitter black coffee that he barely tasted, he kissed Sarah goodbye and loaded Tommy into the car for school. "Dad, why are we leaving so early?" Tommy asked, rubbing his sleepy eyes and clutching his favorite dinosaur lunchbox, its plastic surface worn smooth from years of use. "Just want to beat the traffic, buddy," Rick replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the quiet suburban streets, lined with neat rows of houses still dark in the early morning light. They arrived at the school parking lot 20 minutes before the first bell, the asphalt still damp with morning dew that sparkled like scattered diamonds. After dropping Tommy off at the entrance, where a few other early arriving students trudged sleepily toward the doors, Rick didn't drive away as usual. Instead, he parked his car in a secluded spot behind a row of towering oak trees, with a clear view of the student parking area through the gnarled branches. His heart began to race when he spotted the Thompson twins' silver Honda Civic pulling into the lot, its chrome trim gleaming in the early morning sun like polished mirrors. The girls emerged from their car with practiced grace, both wearing matching blue sweaters that complemented their dark skin and carrying their worn backpacks slung over their shoulders. They walked together toward the school entrance, their heads held high despite everything they'd endured, completely unaware of his presence in the shadows. Rick waited until they disappeared inside the building, counting to 60 under his breath like he used to do during police surveillance operations. He glanced around the parking lot. It was mostly empty, with just a few early arriving teachers clutching travel mugs of steaming coffee as they headed inside, their shoes clicking against the pavement. Perfect. Moving quickly but casually like someone checking their own vehicle, he approached the twins' car. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small knife he'd grabbed from his collection of prank supplies, its blade glinting menacingly in the morning light like a serpent's fang. His hands trembled slightly as he crouched down beside the driver's side tire, his breath coming in short bursts that formed tiny clouds in the cool air. The knife made a soft hissing sound as it penetrated the rubber, a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet lot like a whispered accusation. Rick moved methodically from tire to tire, making sure each one was properly punctured, the rubber slowly collapsing under the weight of the car with quiet sighs of defeat. The act felt simultaneously thrilling and sickening, sending waves of conflicting emotions through his body like alternating currents of hot and cold. Next, he pulled out a thick black marker, uncapping it with trembling fingers that betrayed his nervousness. His hand steady now, fueled by a surge of misplaced righteousness, he wrote on the driver's side window, "Go back where you came from." He added more slurs and racist messages across the other windows, his writing growing larger and more aggressive with each word, the marker squeaking against the glass like nails on a chalkboard. As he finished the last letter, a car door slammed somewhere in the lot, the sound like a gunshot in the morning quiet. Rick quickly pocketed his marker and walked away at a measured pace, fighting the urge to run. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air, his police training kicking in to keep his movements natural and unhurried, just as he'd learned years ago at the academy. Back in his car, Rick's heart was pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal trying to escape. He sat there for a moment, staring at his handiwork from across the lot, unable to look away. The black letters stood out starkly against the silver car, impossible to miss in the strengthening morning light. The deflated tires made the vehicle lean sadly to one side, like a wounded animal awaiting its fate. "That'll teach them," he muttered to himself, starting his engine with shaking hands that could barely grip the key. As he drove away, he could see more students beginning to arrive in their parents' cars, some already pointing at the vandalized vehicle and pulling out their phones to take pictures, their faces showing mixtures of shock and disgust. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, but he felt a dark satisfaction settling in his chest like a heavy weight, even as a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that this wasn't right, that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The Thompson twins emerged from the school building that afternoon, engaged in quiet conversation about their calculus test. Their steps faltered as they approached their car, both stopping dead in their tracks at the sight before them. Their silver Honda Civic sat dejected in the parking lot, all four tires completely flat, and hateful messages scrawled across every window in thick black marker. Kylie's hand flew to her mouth while Shane's fingers curled into tight fists at her sides. Neither spoke for a long moment, taking in the damage with expressions that mixed shock, hurt, and resignation. "We should call Dad," Shane finally said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Kylie shook her head, her braids swaying gently. "No, he's dealing with that big trafficking case right now. He doesn't need this on his plate too." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through her contacts. "I'll call Uncle Marcus, he can help us get it towed." From his hiding spot behind a large SUV several spaces away, Rick watched the scene unfold. He'd expected tears, outbursts, or at least some display of distress. Instead, he saw two young women handling the situation with a composure that seemed beyond their years. They made several phone calls, documented the damage with photos, and waited patiently for assistance to arrive. Their maturity only served to fuel Rick's anger. In his mind, their calm response felt like defiance, as if they were somehow above the fear he'd tried to instill. His fingers gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. "This isn't enough," he muttered to himself, watching as a tow truck pulled into the parking lot. "They need to learn their place." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, but he couldn't stop the dark thoughts from swirling through his mind. He needed to do something bigger, something that would leave a lasting mark on their perfect little lives. The twins stood close together as their car was loaded onto the tow truck, their shoulders touching in a subtle display of mutual support. Rick observed how other students approached them, offering rides and words of encouragement. The show of solidarity made his stomach churn. When it was time to pick up his son Tommy from the elementary school wing, Rick drove around to the other lot, his mind still churning with possibilities for his next move. Tommy bounded into the car with his usual energy, chattering about his day and the upcoming science fair. But Rick barely heard him. His thoughts were consumed with planning something that would truly shake the Thompson twins' world. As he drove home, Rick's mind raced through various scenarios, each more extreme than the last. He needed something that would scar them emotionally, something they wouldn't easily recover from. But what exactly that would be, he couldn't yet determine. The uncertainty gnawed at him as he pulled into his driveway, his son's cheerful voice becoming background noise to the dark symphony of his thoughts. That evening, Tommy wandered down the hallway toward his father's study, clutching his math homework that he needed help with. As he approached the partially open door, he heard his father's voice, low and angry, muttering to himself, "Get some guys from the old neighborhood, make it look like an accident. Those Thompson girls won't know what hit them." Tommy froze, his worksheet forgotten in his trembling hands. He recognized the names, Kylie and Shane Thompson. They were juniors at his school who helped run the peer mentoring program. His heart started beating faster as he pieced together what his father was saying. Rick continued his dark mustering, unaware of his son's presence. Maybe crash into their car, teach them a real lesson this time. Unable to stay quiet any longer, Tommy pushed the door open. "Dad, you can't." Rick spun around in his chair, face flushing red at being caught. "Tommy, what are you... How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," Tommy said, his voice shaking but determined. "You can't hurt Kylie and Shane. They're good people." Rick's expression hardened. "You don't understand, son. While I was away for those 6 months, separated from you and your mother, it was because of them. They need to pay for what they put our family through." Tommy shook his head vigorously. "No, Dad, you don't understand. Those girls, they helped me. Remember when I told you about those 5th graders who were picking on me last month? I didn't tell you the whole story." Rick's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They were pushing me around behind the gym trying to take my lunch money. Kylie and Shane saw it happening. They stepped in and stopped it. They didn't just make the bullies leave, they talked to them, got them to apologize. Now those kids are actually nice to me." Tommy's eyes welled with tears. "They didn't even know who I was, Dad. They just helped because it was the right thing to do." Rick sat back in his chair, the anger in his face giving way to confusion. "They helped you?" "Please don't hurt them," Tommy pleaded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I know you were away for a long time and I know it was hard. It was hard for us too, but hurting them won't make anything better." Rick stared at his son for a long moment, seeing the earnest concern in his young face. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor of his hatred. I'll think about it, Tommy," he said finally, his voice softer than before. "Maybe you're right. Maybe there's been enough hurt already." Tommy stepped forward and hugged his father tightly. "Promise you'll at least consider letting it go?" Rick wrapped his arms around his son, feeling the tension begin to drain from his shoulders. "I promise I'll consider it, buddy. I promise." The next morning dawned crisp and clear as Rick pulled up again to the school drop-off zone. A gentle breeze rustled through the autumn leaves as Tommy gathered his backpack and gave his father a meaningful look before heading inside. Rick watched him go, still wrestling with their conversation from the previous night, his son's words about forgiveness echoing in his mind. He remained parked, his eyes methodically scanning the parking lot. Despite promising Tommy he'd consider letting go of his vendetta, old habits died hard, and the familiar tension crept into his shoulders. He spotted the Thompson twins' car pulling into its usual spot, the silver sedan gleaming in the early morning sun. As Kylie and Shane stepped out of their vehicle, book bags slung over their shoulders, a dark van suddenly screeched to a halt beside them. Rick sat up straighter, his police instincts kicking in as adrenaline flooded his system. Two men in black ski masks leaped out, moving with frightening efficiency that spoke of careful planning. The twins tried to scream, but the attackers were too quick, their movements synchronized and practiced. One man pressed cloth against their mouths, while the other roughly pushed them into the van, their school supplies scattering across the asphalt. Their muffled cries echoed across the nearly empty parking lot, sending chills down Rick's spine. Rick's hands gripped his steering wheel, knuckles turning white as ivory. His mind raced through possibilities. He wasn't on active duty, had no weapon, no radio, no backup. The rational part of his brain told him to call 911, but something else nagged at him, a gut feeling he couldn't ignore. By the time patrol cars arrived, the van could be long gone, taking the girls with it. The van's tires squealed against the pavement as it peeled out of the parking lot, leaving behind dark rubber marks. Rick's heart pounded against his ribs as he watched the vehicle carrying the DA's daughters disappear around the corner. These were the same girls he'd been plotting against just hours ago, the same ones who'd protected his son from bullies when they had every reason to turn away. Without further hesitation, Rick threw his car into drive and pulled out after the van, his decision made in a split second. He maintained a careful distance, not wanting to tip off the kidnappers that they were being followed. His phone lay on the passenger seat, screen dark and silent, but he couldn't risk taking his eyes off the van to make a call, knowing that even a moment's distraction could mean losing them. The van weaved through morning traffic, taking back streets and less traveled roads, clearly following a predetermined escape route. Rick's training kicked in as he noted street names and landmarks, mentally mapping their route while keeping 3 car lengths between them. Though his palms were sweaty and his mouth dry as cotton, years of police work helped him maintain his focus on the task at hand. Through his windshield, he could see the van's tinted windows, knowing somewhere behind that dark glass were 2 terrified girls. Girls who, despite his previous feelings toward them, needed help desperately. The same girls who had shown kindness to his son when they had every reason to be bitter, who had risen above the prejudice he'd shown them. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him as he followed the vehicle deeper into the city's maze of streets. Rick's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, keeping one eye firmly on the van ahead. He pressed the speed dial for D.A. Thompson's office, his heart hammering against his chest. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. D.A. Thompson speaking. "Sir, this is Officer Rick Stanton," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Your daughters. They've been kidnapped outside their school. I'm following the van right now." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "What? Where are you?" Thompson's usually composed voice cracked with fear. "We're heading east on Madison Street, approaching the industrial district. Black van, tinted windows, license plate starts with XRK." Rick swerved slightly to avoid a delivery truck, never letting the van out of his sight. "They're moving fast, but I'm staying with them." "I'm alerting all units now," Thompson said, his voice shifting into action mode. "Stay on the line, Rick. Don't lose that van." Rick could hear Thompson barking orders in the background, the sound of phones ringing and voices rising in urgency. The DA was mobilizing every available officer in the area. "They're turning onto Warehouse Row," Rick reported, watching the van navigate through the nearly empty streets of the industrial zone. "Lots of abandoned buildings here. Perfect place to disappear." "All units are converging on your location," Thompson responded. "We've got cars blocking all exit routes from the industrial district. Whatever you do, don't lose them." The van suddenly accelerated as if the kidnappers had spotted something in their rearview mirror. Rick pressed harder on the gas, maintaining his distance while trying not to look too obvious about following them. "Sir," Rick said, his voice lower now, "I know I'm the last person you'd want helping your daughters right now, but I swear I'll do everything I can to keep them safe." There was a brief pause on the line before Thompson replied, "Just help bring my girls home, Rick. That's all that matters right now." The sound of distant sirens began to fill the air, and Rick could see flashing lights reflecting off the buildings ahead. The trap was being set, with police units moving to seal off every possible escape route. "They're about to hit the roadblock on Mason Street," Rick reported, watching as the van's brake lights suddenly flared red. "They've spotted the police units. They're turning around." The van executed a sharp U-turn, tires screeching on the pavement. Rick had to swerve to avoid being spotted as the vehicle rushed past him in the opposite direction. He quickly turned his car around to resume the pursuit. "They're heading back toward Carter Avenue," he told Thompson, who was coordinating with dispatch to redirect units to the new location. "They're boxed in now. Units behind them, units ahead. We've got them." The sound of sirens grew louder as police cars converged from all directions, the net tightening around the kidnappers' van. Rick's heart pounded as he realized this nightmare might soon be over, hoping against hope that the twins were unharmed inside that van. "All units in position," Thompson's voice came through the phone, tight with controlled tension. "We're ready to move in." Police cars swarmed around the black van, their sirens wailing and lights flashing in a dizzying display of red and blue. Officers emerged from their vehicles with weapons drawn, surrounding the kidnappers' van in a tight circle of authority and firepower. "Come out with your hands up," an officer commanded through a megaphone, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls. After tense moments, the van's doors slowly opened. Two men emerged with their hands raised, immediately being forced to the ground and handcuffed. Officers rushed to the back of the van, finding Kylie and Shane huddled together, scared but unharmed. The screech of tires announced D.A. Thompson's arrival. He burst from his car before it had fully stopped, running toward his daughters as officers helped them out of the van. His face was etched with worry and relief as he wrapped both girls in a tight embrace. "My girls," he whispered, holding them close. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "We're fine, Dad," Kylie assured him, her voice shaky but strong. "Just scared," Shane added, clinging to her father. Thompson looked up, his eyes finding Rick standing awkwardly to the side. The DA's expression softened as he released his daughters and approached the officer. "Rick," Thompson said, extending his hand. "Thank you. If you hadn't been there?" He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Rick accepted the handshake stiffly, guilt churning in his stomach. "Just doing my job, sir." "No, this was more than that," Thompson insisted. "You've really changed these past months, getting over your prejudices, seeing people for who they really are. It shows real growth." Rick shifted uncomfortably, thinking about the slashed tires and hateful messages he'd left on the girl's car just yesterday. The plans he'd been making for worse acts of revenge felt like poison in his mind. It's nothing, really," Rick mumbled, unable to meet Thompson's eyes. The twins stood beside their father, looking at Rick with a mixture of gratitude and lingering wariness. They had no idea that their recent car troubles were his doing, that their rescuer was also their tormentor. "Well, we should get the girls home," Thompson said, putting an arm around each of his daughters. "They've been through enough today." Rick nodded, watching as Thompson led his daughters away. Officers around them were processing the scene, leading the kidnappers to patrol cars, taking statements from witnesses. The chaos of the moment was settling into routine police work. "Take care," Thompson called over his shoulder as they walked away, leaving Rick standing alone with his conflicting emotions. Rick watched them go, the weight of his recent actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. The irony of being thanked for saving the very people he'd been plotting against wasn't lost on him. He turned away from the scene, heading back to his own car with heavy steps. The afternoon sun filtered through the precinct windows as Rick sorted through paperwork at his desk. His phone buzzed, displaying the school's number. His heart skipped a beat. Calls from school during the day were never good news. "Officer Stanton speaking," he answered, his voice tense. "Mr. Stanton, this is Principal Martinez. There's been an incident involving your son. He's being transported to Memorial Hospital right now." Rick's hand tightened around the phone. "What happened? Is he okay?" "He was involved in an altercation with some older students. The paramedics are taking precautions, but you should get to the hospital right away." Rick barely remembered grabbing his keys and jacket. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and honking horns. His mind conjured worst-case scenarios with each passing minute. Bursting through the emergency room doors, Rick spotted his wife Sarah in the waiting area. Her face was pale, mascara smeared from crying. "Sarah!" He rushed to her side. "How is he? What happened?" She gripped his hands tightly. "He's getting checked out now. Rick, you won't believe what happened." She took a shaky breath. Some high school boys were hassling him near the basketball courts. They pushed him and he fell backward toward the concrete steps. But one of the Thompson girls, she saw it happening and ran over. She managed to grab him before his head hit the steps. Rick felt like all the air had been sucked from his lungs. "Thompson? You mean—" "Yes, one of D.A. Thompson's daughters. The principal said she didn't hesitate, just rushed right in. She got knocked down too, but she made sure Tommy didn't hit his head. She probably saved him from a serious injury." Rick sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak. The same girls he'd been tormenting for months, the ones whose car he'd vandalized, whose lives he'd planned to make miserable. One of them had just saved his son. Principal Martinez arrived shortly after, having followed the ambulance to the hospital. She approached Rick and Sarah with a concerned expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, I wanted to check on Tommy and give you more details about what happened." She sat across from them. "If Kylie Thompson hadn't acted so quickly, your son could have suffered a severe head injury. Those steps are concrete and he was falling backward." She shook her head. "I've already suspended the boys involved in the altercation, but I wanted you to know how fortunate we were that Kylie was there and didn't hesitate to help." Rick felt sick to his stomach. All his assumptions, all his hatred, and here was one of these girls proving herself to be more noble than he could ever claim to be. He thought about the hateful messages he'd scrawled on their car, the plans he'd made to cause them harm, and in return, they'd shown nothing but courage and kindness. Is Kylie okay?" he managed to ask, his voice rough. "Yeah, she has some scrapes and bruises from the fall, but she refused medical attention. She just wanted to make sure Tommy was all right." Rick pressed his hands to his face, overwhelmed by shame and gratitude. The weight of his recent actions pressed down on him like a physical burden. Here he'd been, plotting revenge against someone who would risk their own safety to protect his child. The realization of how wrong he'd been, how twisted his thinking had become, hit him like a punch to the gut. Rick stood outside Tommy's hospital room, gathering his courage. Through the window, he could see D.A. Thompson and both twins sitting with his son, who was now awake and talking animatedly despite the bandages on his arm. The sight made his heart clench with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The conversation in the room stopped as all eyes turned to him. D.A. Thompson's eyebrows rose in surprise, while the twins maintained their composed demeanor. I hope I'm not interrupting," Rick said, his voice unusually hesitant. "I wanted to speak with you all." D.A. Thompson stood, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Officer Stanton." Rick's gaze moved to the twins, settling on Kylie, who had a small bandage on her elbow, evidence of her fall while saving Tommy. "I heard what you did for my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to thank you personally." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "But more than that, I need to tell you that I was wrong, so wrong about everything." His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "I've spent months carrying around prejudices that I never questioned, making judgments about people I didn't know or try to understand." Kylie looked at him with clear, steady eyes. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "I just did what was right." Her simple response hit Rick like a physical blow, the complete absence of bitterness or resentment in her voice, the pure sincerity of her words. It stripped away his last defenses. He stood there, speechless, as the full weight of his previous actions crashed over him. D.A. Thompson watched this exchange carefully, noting the genuine remorse in Rick's expression. After a moment, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The tension in the room shifted subtly, making way for something that felt like understanding. Tommy spoke up from his bed. "Dad, Kylie was so fast, she just appeared out of nowhere and caught me before I hit the steps." Rick looked at his son's bright face, then back at Kylie. The contrast between who he'd thought these girls were and who they'd proven to be was overwhelming. He saw now the strength of their character, the integrity that he'd been too blind to recognize before. "I don't deserve your kindness," he admitted quietly. "But I'm grateful for it. More grateful than I can say." That evening, Rick sat in his living room, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of his leather armchair as he shifted uncomfortably. His wife had gone to prepare dinner, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his son, who was resting on the couch with his arm carefully propped up. The weight of guilt pressed heavily on Rick's chest as he remembered every hateful act he'd committed against the Thompson twins. The slashed tires, the racist messages, the plans for worse. It all seemed so senseless now, so cruel and small-minded. He ran his hands over his face, feeling the shame burn through him. "Dad?" Tommy's voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you okay?" Rick looked at his son, seeing the concern in his young face. "I'm just thinking about today, buddy." "Kylie was amazing, wasn't she?" Tommy's eyes lit up as he spoke. "She came out of nowhere like a superhero. When those bigger kids pushed me toward the stairs, I thought I was going to fall bad. But she caught me, Dad. She's my hero." Rick's throat tightened at his son's words. Here was his boy singing the praises of someone he had targeted with such baseless hatred. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been plotting revenge, one of the twins had been watching out for his son. "Tommy," Rick said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something." He moved to sit closer to his son. "I haven't been a good person lately. I've done things, terrible things, because I judged people without knowing them. I was wrong about the Thompson twins, so wrong." Tommy looked at his father with surprise, but there was understanding in his young face too. "Is that why you were so angry about them before?" Rick nodded, feeling the shame wash over him again. "I let my prejudices control me. I didn't want to see people for who they really were. I'm so sorry, son. I want you to know that's not the kind of man I want to be anymore. It's not the kind of man I want you to become." Tommy reached out with his good arm and patted his father's hand. "It's never too late, Dad," he said with the simple wisdom of youth. "That's what you always tell me when I make mistakes, remember?" Rick felt tears prick at his eyes. His son's forgiveness and encouragement, so freely given, touched something deep inside him. He saw now how his hatred had not only poisoned his view of others, but had threatened to poison his relationship with his own child. "You're right, buddy," he said softly, squeezing his son's hand gently. "It's never too late to change, to be better." The next morning, Rick stood outside the DA's office, his heart pounding in his chest. The polished brass nameplate reading District Attorney Samuel Thompson seemed to mock his past actions. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants and took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," D.A. Thompson's deep voice called from inside. Rick entered to find the twins, Kylie and Shane, seated beside their father's desk. Their faces remained neutral, but their body language showed tension. They sat straight-backed, hands folded in their laps, watching him carefully. "Mr. Thompson, girls," Rick began, his voice shakier than he'd intended. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." D.A. Thompson gestured to an empty chair. "Have a seat, Officer Stanton." Rick sat down, feeling the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on him. The office felt smaller than he remembered, the air thick with unspoken words. "I came here today because I owe all of you an apology," Rick said, forcing himself to meet their eyes. "What I did, the way I treated you girls, it was inexcusable." His voice cracked slightly. I let my prejudices control my actions. I targeted you, harassed you, and planned even worse things, all because of the color of your skin." The twins exchanged a quick glance but remained silent. D.A. Thompson's expression remained unchanged, watching Rick intently. "When my son told me how you saved him, Kylie," Rick continued, turning to face her directly, "it shattered everything I thought I knew. While I was plotting against you, you were protecting my boy. You showed more character and courage than I've shown in my entire career." Tears welled up in Rick's eyes, but he pressed on. "I'm not just sorry for what I did. I'm ashamed. Ashamed of the hatred I carried. Ashamed of the example I set for my son. Ashamed of how I abused my position as an officer." D.A. Thompson leaned forward in his chair. "Officer Stanton, what exactly are you hoping to achieve with this apology?" "Nothing, sir," Rick replied honestly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just needed you all to know that I understand now how wrong I was, and that your daughter's kindness opened my eyes to my own failures." After a moment of silence, Kylie spoke softly. "We knew about the car, you know, the slashed tires, the messages." Rick's face burned with shame. "I know, but we didn't report it," Shane added, "because we hoped you'd find a better way forward on your own." D.A. Thompson cleared his throat. "Officer Stanton, change isn't measured in words, but in actions. Your apology seems sincere, but trust, once broken, must be earned back through consistent effort and demonstrated growth." Rick nodded, wiping his eyes. "I understand, sir. I want to be better. For my son, for this community, for myself. I know it won't happen overnight, but I'm committed to doing the work, to earning back the trust I destroyed." The twins shared another look before Kylie spoke again. "We accept your apology, Officer Stanton." "Thank you," Rick whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The call came in during Rick's afternoon patrol. Mrs. Jenkins' voice trembled on the other end of the line, her usual warmth replaced by raw fear. "Officer Stanton, please help. My Malik hasn't come home since last night." Rick remembered Mrs. Jenkins from his community service, a kind-faced grandmother who always offered him sweet tea during his rounds. Her grandson, Malik, was 17, a bright kid who'd been caught between his academic potential and the pull of street life. "When did you last see him?" Rick asked, already turning his patrol car around. "Yesterday after school. He said he was going to study at the library, but..." Mrs. Jenkins's voice cracked. "Some boys have been pressuring him lately. Bad crowd. I'm scared, Officer Stanton." Rick's stomach tightened. He knew exactly which crowd she meant. The same group he'd stopped and searched countless times in his old precinct, driven by his prejudices. "I'll find him, Mrs. Jenkins. I promise." For the next several hours, Rick canvassed the neighborhood. He visited Malik's favorite spots, talked to his friends, and showed his photo to local shopkeepers. Each dead end only strengthened his determination. As dusk approached, a tip from a convenience store owner led Rick to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The building loomed dark and silent, its broken windows like empty eyes. Inside, Rick found Malik huddled in a corner, knees drawn to his chest. The teen flinched at Rick's flashlight beam. "Malik?" Rick kept his voice gentle, lowering the light. "Your grandmother's worried sick about you." "Officer Stanton," Malik's voice quavered. "They're looking for me, the Kings. They said if I don't join them." Rick approached slowly, crouching down beside the frightened boy. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We don't have to report this officially if you don't want to." Malik looked up, surprise crossing his tear-stained face. "You won't arrest me?" "No." Rick shook his head. "Right now I just want to help." Gradually, Malik began to talk. He spoke about the pressure to join the gang, his dreams of college, the weight of expectations from both sides of his life. Rick listened, really listened, seeing not a potential criminal but a scared kid trying to navigate a world that didn't make it easy for him. "You know," Rick said softly, "my son's about your age. He loves science too." "Yeah?" Malik wiped his eyes. "What does he want to be?" A doctor, just like you." They talked for almost an hour until Malik's breathing steadied and his shoulders relaxed. Rick saw pieces of his own son in this boy. The same hopes, the same fears, just wrapped in different circumstances. When they finally pulled up to Mrs. Jenkins's house, she rushed out onto the porch, enveloping Malik in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she held him. "Thank you, Officer Stanton," she sobbed, reaching out to grasp Rick's hand. "Thank you for bringing my baby home." Rick felt something shift inside him as he watched grandmother and grandson cling to each other. The labels and prejudices that had once seemed so fixed in his mind continued to crumble, replaced by something deeper: understanding, empathy, connection. The local diner buzzed with the usual evening crowd as Rick and Malik sat in their regular booth. The red vinyl seats squeaked as Malik leaned forward, excitedly sharing his latest science project ideas. The aroma of fresh coffee and grilled burgers wafted through the air, mixing with the gentle hum of conversation and clinking silverware. "So if we adjust the solar panel's angle just right," Malik explained, sketching on a napkin with quick, precise strokes, "we could increase efficiency by at least 20%, and I've been thinking about adding a tracking system too." Rick nodded, genuinely impressed by the teenager's enthusiasm. Over the past few weeks, their mentorship had grown into something meaningful, something that filled a void he hadn't even known existed. He'd helped Malik with college applications, reviewed his essays, and watched proudly as the young man's confidence grew with each passing day. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Rick's stomach tightened as he recognized the familiar swagger of Officer James Garrett. His old partner's uniform was as crisp as ever, but his expression soured as he surveyed the diner's diverse clientele. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a reminder of the authority he wielded. "Well, well," Garrett drawled, approaching their booth with deliberate slowness. "If it isn't Rick Stanton. Hardly recognized you without your patrol car." His eyes flicked dismissively to Malik, barely acknowledging his presence. "Doing some community outreach?" Rick straightened in his seat, his shoulders squaring instinctively. "Garrett, this is Malik. He's heading to college next fall, planning to study engineering. Kid's got a brilliant mind for science." "Is that right?" Garrett's tone dripped with condescension, his lips curling into a smirk. "Quite the change from your old approach, Rick. Remember how we used to handle these neighborhoods? The good old days?" Malik tensed beside Rick, his hands curling into fists under the table. The napkin with his careful drawings crumpled slightly in his grip. "Things change, Garrett," Rick said firmly, his voice carrying across the now quieting diner. "People change. These are good people who deserve our respect. Every single one of them." Garrett snorted, adjusting his belt with practiced arrogance. "Respect? Come on, Rick. Don't tell me you've gone soft. What happened to the guy who knew how to keep order? The one who understood what really matters out there?" Rick stood up slowly, meeting Garrett's gaze with unwavering determination. "That guy was wrong. He was prejudiced and afraid. These people aren't the enemy. They're our community. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who needs to change." "You're unbelievable," Garrett scoffed, his face flushing with anger. 6 months in this dump and suddenly you're their champion? What happened to having each other's backs? To the brotherhood?" "I've got the community's back now," Rick replied, his voice steady and clear. "And I'm proud of that. More proud than I ever was before." Garrett's face hardened, his jaw clenching visibly. "Well, good luck with your new friends. Just remember who your real allies are." He turned and stalked out of the diner, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the blinds. Rick sank back into his seat, feeling both drained and relieved. The tension slowly leaked from his shoulders as the diner's usual atmosphere resumed. When he looked up, he found Malik watching him with newfound respect, his dark eyes thoughtful. "That was your old partner?" Malik asked quietly, smoothing out his crumpled napkin. Rick nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "That was the old me too. Not anymore, though. Sometimes the hardest part of changing is facing who you used to be." "Thank you," Malik said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "For standing up to him, for being different." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. The ceiling fan whirred overhead, and somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clattered. Rick knew he'd just burned a bridge with his past, but looking at Malik's grateful expression, at the trust and hope shining in the young man's eyes, he felt nothing but certainty about his choice. This was the right path, the only path forward. If you enjoyed the story of Rick, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.